Okay, I just wanted to start off by talking briefly about what the bias is. So we have our straight grains, which go along the fibers here. So straight grain and the cross grain. And the bias is at an exactly 45-degree angle to the straight grain and cross grain. So this is the true bias. And you'll notice that the fabric has quite a bit of stretch in that direction. So when we use bias tape, we are taking advantage of that stretch. So I'm going to show you some different examples of bias tapes. Here's one that I have cut myself. You can see on the back, if you look closely, it's exactly at that 45-degree angle. This is just one that I cut. I haven't folded it, and you'll see why in just a minute, how I like to use this. Then we have this one. This is called single fold bias. Okay, I cut this one myself as well, and then it's folded with seam allowances just into the middle like that. The finished width of this one is right on 1/2 inch. The cut width of this one is 1 inch. This one is called double fold bias. It's just like the single fold bias. It's got the edges turned under, but then it's folded in half again. I'll show you some ways to use this. Oh, sorry, this is a very narrow one. Quite difficult to use in my opinion. So when it's unfolded, it's that 1/2 inch, just, yeah, 1/2 inch, and so then folded, it's a 1/4 inch. This one is a double fold bias as well that I bought. So unfolded, it's just under 1 inch, and then folded to be a double fold bias. So I'm going to show you some different ways to use bias tape. The first finish I'm going to show you is a Hong Kong binding, and this is my favorite binding. So yeah, what we're going to do is we're going to put the right side of the bias tape along the cut edge of the fabric. Notice that in this case I'm using one that isn't folded, and I'll show you what it looks like with one that has been pressed. Then I'm just going to sew it along, keeping an even seam allowance of a 1/4 inch. My sewing machine talks to you. Okay, then we'll press it over like this, and then over again to the back. Now you can see through there that on the wrong side, it's actually overlapping. It's still a raw edge on the wrong side. So we're wrapping this around like this, around that raw edge to finish it, to bind it. And then we're going to sew in the ditch. So sew just in this kind of, I guess, right in that seam right there. So I'm going to press this and come back and show you what that looks like. So I have pressed it around. You can see it through the fabric. Okay, this is that raw edge. Now I like a Hong Kong finish because it creates very little bulk. So now I'm going to sew right in here, right along that ditch. Now it's going to be a bit more visible than it would be normally because I'm using black thread. But if you're using matching thread, you won't really be able to see it. So that is the Hong Kong binding. Now it's really nice if this were inside of a jacket, and that's why it's got the name. Like if this were part of a seam allowance, it creates the least bulk possible. I'm going to show you a true bias binding using double fold bias. Now you'll notice that on one side it's folded a little bit less than the other. So this side is like shorter, the top side that's uppermost, and the side that is lowermost is a little bit longer. Can you see that? So I'm going to put the side that is lowermost on the bottom, and that is just to ensure that I'm catching it. Now this is the simplest way to do it, and it is literally just like pushing my raw edge into the fold and then pin stitching. I like to just catch the first bit to just secure it, and then I'm just going to fold it over and run a pin stitch along. Okay, oops. It's perfectly finished on both sides. Okay, here's another way of doing a bias finish. Okay, so this is using single fold bias. What we're going to do is this is the wrong side of the fabric. The wrong side. You can actually do it with the right side, but it's easier to do it on the wrong side. I'm opening up one of the folds, and I'm going to stitch right along that fold line. Okay, then I'm going to fold it over, and I'm going to fold it over again. Now, the difference between this and a Hong Kong bind is the Hong Kong bind would have this side unfolded, and this would be the right side, and there'd be that raw edge here, but because it's bias, it wouldn't unravel. So we're just going to do it instead folded with the folded edge on both sides. Now it just means a clean finish on both sides. I'm going to press it and be back. Okay, so the reason that I have the wrong side, the side that we do first, is so that when I'm pin stitching it down, there's no danger of not catching the underside. So it doesn't matter if the underside's a little bit messier, I suppose. I'm just going to pin stitch this edge down. There we go. So finished on both sides. You can see it's a little bit messier on this side, but it's not really a big deal because you won't see that. Yeah, so the advantage is that it is fully finished on both sides. The final bias finish I'm going to show you is a bias facing. So here's a pretend neckline. Now, you would normally do this with the shoulder seam sewn around the whole neckline, but I'm just going to show you. You can also do it around an armhole. So I'm going to start by, this is the right side of the fabric. I'm going to start by unfolding one edge of the bias tape, and I'm going to sew it on right in that crease, matching those raw edges. Just going to cut off this nasty bit here. There we go. Now, if this were a full circle, I would just advise leaving a little bit free here, and you'll see why in just a minute. So I'm just going to start about an inch or so from the end. Okay. Now, here is where I advise not stretching, making sure you're not stretching that bias tape. In fact, well, you can stretch the bias tape, but not the fabric underneath. Okay. I'm just following that curve. So I'm kind of almost like pushing the neckline a bit while I pull the tape. So I'm stretching the tape and no, easing in the neck just a tiny bit. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is have a look on the wrong side. You can see that very slight puckering here. That's fine. What we're going to do is we're going to flip this bias tape to the inside, okay, and then clean finish it on the outside, okay. But because it's a curve, we need to do some clipping. So I'm going to take my scissors. This is an inside curve, so I'm just going to do some clips along this curve so that it sits nicely. Now, what I forgot to say actually is if you were doing this if it was a completed neckline, it was a circle, what you would do is you would do all the way around and leave about 1 inch unsewn at each end. Then you would join it together and then you would sew this bit down. So now I'm going to take the bias and I'm going to flip it up. Okay, you don't need to press it. I'm going to understitch. So that's stitching, like pin stitching, pin's width away from this seam, just to hold these seam allowances to the bias tape. Making sure it's flipped the right way. Okay, I'm going to press this up first like this, and then I'm going to press it to the inside, rolling it to the inside. Okay, this is what the neckline is going to look like. Obviously, it would look a whole lot better if everything matched. This is what it's going to look like on the inside at this point. Okay, we've got this pressed over, and you can see this edge here has stretched a bit because it's on the bias, and then all the seam allowances are pushed up. Now what I'm going to do is pin stitch around this edge here to hold it down. Okay, I'm going to give it a press, but once it's pressed, it will sit really nice and flat. And here's what it looks like finished. So, on the wrong side. the last one I'm going to show you is a bit of a weird one. It's what I call a self-bound seam. So you would start off with either kind of like, you know what, it's actually a lot like a flat felled seam, except it's going to kind of look like a French seam. So you'll have your, basically we're going to sew a seam, and then we're going to wrap this seam allowance around it, okay, and finish it. So I'm going to leave a fair bit here just to show you, and then I'm going to sew the seam about a 1/4 inch. So I'm sewing it. This is 1.5 centimeters offset. It doesn't need to be that much, but I'm just going to do it big to show you. Okay, so you've got those 2 seams. Then what I'm going to do is fold this in over like this. Okay, and then fold it over again, not quite to that seam. Okay, I'll be back and show you. So we've got it kind of bound over, and I'm going to pin stitch down here. Okay, so if I open that up, that seam up, it's just a normal looking seam. It almost looks like a French seam, but not. It's a self-bound seam. Now, the real difference between this and, say, a French seam is that you can do it really small. You can do it by hand even, and do it just a tiny one, and I use that on armholes sometimes. The real difference between that and a bias bound edge is a bias bound edge is obviously on the bias, and so it has more flexibility. So this is quite an unusual seam finish. I don't use it very often, but it's kind of a good one to have in your back pocket. So those are some bound seams. And a bias facing.